Hello. Welcome to this episode of The Revolution is News. I'm Karin Wulf, and I'm the director and librarian, obviously a tired one, director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library. And I'm delighted to welcome you today. The Revolution is News is a series of virtual conversations featuring more than a dozen scholars who are offering short online introductions to key topics in the broad period of the American Revolution as part of the JCB's 2026 and Beyond initiative. We're welcoming an amazing group of folks to talk about both the big picture, that is, thinking about the revolution and the revolutionary period, and also to share a bit about their research. So that means we get kind of both the bird's eye and the worm's eye view, as it were. The Revolution is News is the second part of journalism in history, when history is news, a project that the JCB is implementing over the course of this year about the important relationship between journalism and history, supporting excellent journalistic coverage of the events of 250 years ago and exploring how historians and journalists work in parallel and often synergistic ways. This project is really important to us. The idea is to create a resource here in this third piece, a video library of materials as part of the JCB's ongoing project. We've been thinking and talking a lot about how we can help support folks who are reading, writing, and speaking about the revolution in this year of commemoration. So today is the third installment, and my guest today is Dr. Adam McNeil. It's such a pleasure to introduce someone I've known for a long time and whose work I have admired maybe from the beginning of this work. His many accomplishments include his prize-winning dissertation that he wrote at Rutgers University titled Contested Liberty, Fugitive Women, and the Shadow of Re-Enslavement and Displacement in Revolutionary Virginia. He's a postdoctoral research associate at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia. And this fall, he'll be joining the American Studies faculty at the University of Notre Dame as an assistant professor. We are thrilled to have him talk about the topic of Black loyalism today for The Revolution is News. I invite you to listen and learn with Dr. Adam McNeil. And after Adam is finished talking with us about his work and about this topic, he and I will have a little conversation, and then we will open the Q&A. So feel free to use that function on your Zoom. Okay, Adam, take it away. Except you're muted still, my friend.
Oh my gosh, you would think you talking about some tired. Oh my gosh, here we go. End of the semester.
It's
And after
2026. We're
I'm
all
telling you,
tired.
6 years into this Zoom world, and we're still doing that. So, but nevertheless, I thank you so much, Karen, for all you've done for me since we met way back when 2019 at the OI conference in Pittsburgh, a conference I will forever remember for many reasons, including getting to meet you in the 18-hour drive back to North Carolina. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about my work and especially about Black loyalism. And it gave me a chance to think through some concepts, some ideas that I've been mulling over for a while, but didn't have a chance or a space to fully vet some of these ideas too. And so with the time that is mine, and let me do the second hardest thing in Zoom world, besides keeping yourself unmuted. Alrighty, so we got one part and play from the start. Okay, cool. Alrighty. And so, over the next about 40 minutes or so, I'm going to speak to the topic of the possibilities and pitfalls of Black loyalism in three proclamations and three petitions. And so, this is going to be a three-parter. So, part one, what is Black loyalism and what is a Black loyalist? And so, pioneering historian and author of 1961's The Negro in the American Revolution, Benjamin Quarles offered one of the most insightful quotes about how people of African descent chose sides during the American Revolution. And it reads, in the Revolutionary War, the American Negro was a participant and a symbol. A little ellipses. The Negro's role in the revolution can best be understood by realizing that his major loyalty was not to a place nor to a people, but to a principle. And so, kind of going back to these pioneering words from Quarles, he identifies here that Black people were not loyal to any side, be it British, Tory, or American patriot. Rather, we as a Black person, were loyal to whoever offered us the best shot at freedom. Well, that side were the British. Because even though the American military employed approximately 5,000 soldiers and sailors throughout the war, a number described by historian of the American Revolution Gary Nash as representative of the forgotten fifth, or about a fifth of all American soldiers, it was the British side that gained the most, quote, loyal Black people because they offered the most comprehensive, being the British, and substantive offers of refuge and freedom for tens of thousands of enslaved and free Black people all across the colonies. And so these offers of refuge and freedom conveyed through three proclamations, which we'll talk about a little later, um, lay the foundation for Black loyalism, or the political choice of Black people to ally with the British side for the entire war. Or, things are in limbo at times and change. But that's political identity. People move across parties all the time, political parties, that is. And so this was a term in flux and always contested. But I feel it is still important as an identifier to help us understand why enslaved people made the choices that they did. The term is not also, though, without historiographic or scholarly debate. A brief moment for debate. A Black loyalist myth? Question mark. And so, as the esteemed Karin Wulf pushed me to also provide a layer of historiography, or the history behind the history. And so in 1975, Canadian historian James James W. St. George Walker, I believe, authored an article called "Blacks as American Loyalists: The Slaves' War for Independence." And this essay um, was the predecessor to his 1976 book, "The Black Loyalists: The Search for a Promised Land in Nova Scotia and Sierra Leone," from 1783 to 1870. And we could talk a bit more about the Nova Scotia and Sierra Leonean piece in Q&A, because the section I'm talking about is specific to the war in terms of Black loyalism. And so he identified that by the 70s, the historiography of Black participation in the war overwhelmingly leaned in the direction of Black patriots. As Walker states, and I tend to agree, up to the mid 1970s, most, quote, of the written history of the subject would lead one to believe that the Blacks overwhelmingly supported the Patriot side, end quote. Returning to Quarles, Walker identified that Quarles, in his Negro in the American Revolution, quote, pays far more attention to patriotic Blacks than to Black loyalists. Quarles' front piece, showing a Black soldier spearing a British major, reflects the tone that dominates most writing on the subject. And so Quarles' example can be explained, though, by the era in which he wrote the book, because he authored this amidst the early civil rights movement and the optimism of that particular political moment, when Black freedom felt like a tangible achievement for them, for us, rather, in my grandparents' generation. And so some activists wanted to connect their struggles to Crispus Attucks and not to someone like Colonel Ty, who was an armed Black soldier and revolutionary who fought valiantly against Patriot forces in New Jersey's Jersey Shore, if you know Monmouth County in Northeast rather. Um, and so, nevertheless, Walker stated emphatically in his short essay that Black people were not only capable of wielding the loyalist title, they made common cause with the British and actively participated as loyalists, despite nuances and the differences between Black and white loyalism, a topic we can more actively unpack during the Q&A. And so more scholars began to contribute to this conversation. So as more scholars like Mary Beth Norton, Sylvia Frey, Woody Holden, and others in the 1980s and 1990s wrote more on the Black loyalists as a piece in parts of their work, but maybe not as more comprehensively as Walker, more scholars also began challenging the idea of Black loyalism as a category at all. And so a fellow Canadian, not me, them, became the greatest challenger. So in 1999, Barry Cahill, senior archivist at the Public Archives of Nova Scotia, detailed why he believed Walker's analysis oversold the Black loyalist as a category, and furthermore considered the concept of Black loyalists as a myth in Atlantic Canada. Cahill emphasized that, quote, certainly there were blacks among the loyalists, but the fugitive slaves of patriots who were transported to Nova Scotia concurrently with the loyalists and their slaves did not, by virtue of that fact, become black loyalists, end quote. And so the fugitive slaves were a subcategory of blacks, not loyalists, which is to say, black people could be loyalists, right? But the particular fugitive slaves, which created the majority of the experience of people identified as black loyalists in that particular subcategory, according to Cahill. So personally, I come down on the debate, and to me, and we can get to this on the Q&A side, um, fugitive slaves to me, along with any free black person, to me were representatives of the loyalist broader community, and they were also black loyalists too. There are a lot of nuances to this, and I'd love to kind of chat with folks about that. But I situate myself as someone who believes and identifies that the black people that I'm writing about are loyalists, along with the synonym of black refugees, which I use interchangeably. Um, because ultimately the war destabilized people, and black people were a part of that destabilization, even if maybe they intentionally did not try to side with the British and they were just trying to become free, more to the principle of quarrels. And also in part because this same argument is not necessarily discussed vis-a-vis black patriots. So I'm in Virginia, coming here from Charlottesville, at least for the next less than 2 weeks. Shout out to Notre Dame. Come see you soon. And so if you look at people who aided the Patriot side, like a James Lafayette, a Saul Williams, or Aberdeen, who they all have petitions to the Virginia General Assembly in the 1780s and 1790s pursuing freedom, and they were enslaved during the war. And so what's important is that no one is trying to undercut them being considered quote unquote black patriot, even though their slaveholders were primarily patriots, right? And so this is just something that, once again, like it's an important debate, and I'm glad that we're having. I'm grateful for this forum to be able to discuss it. And so I wanted to give some broader context and also a little bit of a sliver of a debate that has gone on about it and that still animates the field. And so with that, let's pivot to part two, three proclamations. And so the reason why I did this kind of model is that for this part three, I'm laying down the fact that the three proclamations I'm about to discuss are really the foundations of black loyalism, in the sense that they were what black people attached when times got heavy and people were trying to take them out of British lines. These proclamations helped to root them. And so, a lot of nuance, a lot of context. As I know, our fearless leader, Karin Wulf, loves to talk about context, 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 historiography, historiography, historiography. And as a parenthetical note, that's why on my Subaru, I have what she put on she gave me years back. Historiography is lit, a term from way back when. And so shout out to you for that one. And so getting back on subject here, let's talk about the first proclamation here. And so, for those who may not know, in 1775, Virginia's last royal governor, Lord Dunmore, a Scotsman, he had, over the course of 1775, realized that the Patriots of Virginia were certainly challenging him in a lot of different ways. And really, what lit the match and lit the fuse, if you will, was in April 1775 when he removed the gunpowder magazine away from the Capitol in Virginia, or in Virginia, which at that time was Williamsburg. And so with that created this huge frenzy that led to an avalanche effect that led to him actually leaving the governor's palace in the heat of the night, along with his family and not even any of his enslaved people. He left them, and then he effectively would never return to Virginia. And so there was a broader discussion about whether or not at this point, right? Because ultimately, to go back to the Gunpowder magazine, the question for some revolutionaries was they would try to use that if enslaved people would try to rise up as some of these ideas and this push against the tyranny of the British imperial government as for white patriots as indicative of placing chains on them to inhibit their freedom to go past the Appalachians. And so with that, there's a greater kind of fervor about the possibility, not the reality, but the possibility that the British Crown would at least try to emancipate some enslaved people, if not more, to try to quell the rebellion. And that was at the heart of the Virginian process. And if you think about the 1619 Project and all the fervor about that, that small claim of the broader 1619 Project was really where all of the kerfuffle since 2019 has all been about. So really responding to in the last 7 years. And so with that, there might have been conversations and thoughts, but Dunmore's proclamation said in November 1775 that no, your thoughts might have actually been in reality. And so it reads for those who might be listening and doing your dishes and maybe not your, because I listen to a lot of these while I'm doing other things. It reads for Dunmore's proclamation, I do in virtue of the power and authority to me given by His Majesty determined to execute martial law and cause the same to be executed throughout this colony. And to the end that peace and good order may the sooner be restored. I do require every person capable of bearing arms to resort to this Majesty's standard, or be looked upon as traitors to this Majesty's crown and government, and thereby become liable to the penalty the law inflicts upon such offenses. So to go a little bit further in the interest of time, and I do hereby farther declare all indentured servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to rebels, free that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to this Majesty's crown and dignity. And so this was a military measure. This was not an emancipatory proclamation. This was in a Lincolnian sense. This was a moral measure to try to quell the colonial rebellion. And so Dunmore, a slaveholder who by the end of the war would claim nearly 100 people, was saying that that might be true, but I can also try to emancipate some of y'all. That's effectively what we're doing here. And so also indicative of this is was his rationale that he was looking for people to ultimately join his ranks as soldiers, not as camp followers, right? And that's is particular to enslaved women, children, and the elderly, and the infirm. But regardless of that fact, there are different numbers that people use. Excuse me, but about 800 Black people, it is said, upwards, pursued British camp off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. And so with that, and that's where Dunmore was. And this is important because by the end of the summer of 1776, really there were only a couple hundred Black people that were actually surviving, and that's actually being more liberal in the number. And that's because right as it's happening, you're having a rush of Black people who are trying to pursue this opportunity, and many of them reach him, and many of these Black men become soldiers as part of this Ethiopian regiment, right, where there was emblazoned allegedly liberty to slaves on their shirts. And so this was emblematic of the age where Black people are using the war and challenging authority to say that this war might not necessarily be about us, but we will pursue what we want, our just desserts, in terms of trying to pursue freedom. And the British, through Dunmore's proclamation, which wasn't actually a military order because he's not an actual general in any particular kind of way, but nevertheless, Black people for the rest of the war that effectively Dunmore's proclamation would be this linchpin moment from 1775 to 1783 when the war ends. So it's a very, very pivotal piece. But ultimately, by the end of the war, only dozens, a couple dozen, maybe I would say less than 100 would claim the time frame of 1775 or 1776 as Black Virginians that they escaped during this time. And so that's important, right? In the sense of like these people were able to become free, but in the general sense, it did not have as great of effect in terms of what actually happened to people and their ability to actually become free at the end of the war. But it's still representative in an important political moment. And so, with that, what you also have let me back up. Effectively, once the Patriot side quail the rebellion from Dunmore and his fleet, of which there are a couple thousands with him at one point. Some divert to St. Augustine, some divert to Bermuda, um, London, but most go to New York, including the Black Loyalist refugees. And so many of them go to New York, and they would then learn of another proclamation almost simultaneous to their arrival in Manhattan. And so they learned about General Howe's proclamation from 1776. And this is a few days before the British would then ultimately take over and control Manhattan Island for the rest of the war. And so this one reads, and you'll notice that this is less racialized in how it's described, but it's still important. And so it's a proclamation by His Excellency, the Honorable William Howe, General and Commander in Chief of all His Majesty's forces, whereas it is represented that many of the loyal inhabitants of this island have been compelled by the leaders in the rebellion to take arms against His Majesty's government. Notice is hereby given to all persons so forced into rebellion that on delivering themselves up at the headquarters of the army, they'll be received as faithful subjects. And so this is important because what this is saying is that Black people from anywhere can enter New York and claim refugee status, right? And so once again, you would see this in the end of the war when calamity hits, and Black people are attaching themselves not only to a Dunmore's proclamation, but to General Howe's proclamation. But unlike Dunmore's, it's not racialized. It's open. It's ambiguous in an interesting way. And so to kind of learn more, there's an important article that you could read from my homeboy, shout out to Sean Gallagher, that he wrote in Slavery and Abolition, a journal. And if you any of you out there who want to read it, because usually these are hard to come by, if you don't have a university affiliation, shoot me an email. It's called Black Refugees and the Legal Fiction of Military Manumission in the American Revolution. And it came out in 2022. And it's an important piece on, it's an important essay about Black people and their pursuit of opportunities of refuge and military manumission throughout the war. So it gives you a much more in-depth conversation than I can here. But go read it. And so, so this is once again another important proclamation that sets a table for Black people for throughout the war. But this one, I would say. Dunmore is I've read a lot and written a lot about now. Howe's more. But this is the one that really gets me because this one in 1779, at 1775 and 76, the war is early. You don't know when it's going to be over, but it's early. By this time, it's 1779. Uh-oh. The Patriots are they battled back against they forced the British out of the occupation of Philadelphia, and things are not going as well up north as the British would like. And so, in as the war is going on and things are happening, General Henry Clinton, right, Commander in Chief, he is thinking about a Southern strategy, not of the 1980 variety, but of the 1779 variety of moving the war's theaters from the North and the Mid-Atlantic to the South, where they believed that they would have a lot more loyalist assistance from Black and white folks. And so in doing so, he also issued this Phillipsburg Proclamation, June 30th of 1779. And for more about the Southern strategy, check out the amazing, late great Sylvia Frey's "Water from the Rock: Black Resistance in the Revolutionary Age." We can really detail you a bit more in depth about the Southern strategy vis-a-vis the American Revolution. And so this reads, whereas the enemy have adopted a practice of enrolling Negroes among their troops, um, I do hereby give notice that all Negroes taken in arms or uh, or upon any military duty shall be purchased for a stated price, the money to be paid to the captors. But I do mostly forbid any person to sell or claim right over any Negro, the property of a rebel, who may take refuge with any part of the army. Of this army. And I do promise to every Negro who shall desert the rebel standard full security to follow within these lines any occupation which he shall think proper. And so this is important for a number of different reasons because whereas the black loyalists of the Ethiopian regiment were able to fight, there was not a follow up. Primarily, the Patriot side offered the greatest opportunity for black men to become soldiers, right? This 5,000 or so as soldier sailors. Whereas for the British, they were actually more wary of arming black people and therefore, right, the enrolling of Negroes among their troops. But he's not asking, right, for the enrolling of black people, right? So this is also where the entanglement and kind of like the challenge of black loyalism is coming into the fray, where we'll open these opportunities for you to come, but for black men, I don't want to employ you as a soldier. I want you as a black pioneer to clean up, not to place on the same uniforms and to help wield the same weapons. You know, there were individuals who did, but in a more concentrated unit sense, they were not. But then also another important piece here is the fact that they're opening this opportunity up for refuge for black people seeking employment. But there are black people employed as slaves with the British, right, as servants and otherwise. And so this is a way for black people to become loyalists in the sense of seeking refuge. But this is also where it gets a little murky because they're not offering freedom. And that's where the slippage and the challenge and it's a weird way to say it, but the drama where that also comes into the fray. But then also, once again, I wanted to use this time to kind of describe what's going on in this as well, because right before Phillipsburg Proclamation, there was an important moment in which the most number of Black Virginians actually escape, and it happens right before this. And a number of the women who I'm about to talk about were actually they were actually escaping um, Virginia in May of 1779, and Ken Burns, and he gave this moment short shrift and gave Dummer's Proclamation all the shrift, but effectively the short 2 week Chesapeake raid of the Chesapeake of Virginia by the British opened up the opportunity for about 518 black people, or about half of all black people who would join the British in their exit out of New York in 1783. They escaped during this particular moment. And so some of the women who I'm about to talk about from this petition also escaped during this time frame as well. And so once again, this isn't necessarily a comprehensive examination where we can get more in depth. So I'm trying to give a broader striff. So once again, we could talk a little bit more in the Q&A. But in the last part, I want to also discuss some of these petitions that are also at the centerpiece of this conversation in the last part of our the last third of our convo here. And so, if you may or may not know, I'm sorry, the United States won, so they beat the British at the Battle of Yorktown. And so what happens with that? You have the opening. There once was an opening where Black loyalists were siding with the potential winning side, because who would have thought that the most powerful empire in the world at that time would lose to these folks? And so what happens then when the peace happens, right? Frederick Douglass gave this thought a century later during the Reconstruction period. What happens when peace amongst the whites come? Well, black people were probably thinking the same thing. And so in 1782, as the war ends, what you have is that you have this destabilization for black people where it's like, what's going to happen to us? Because we aided the British, right? We were Black Loyalists. We cleaned we cleaned these officers' chamber pots, and if you know what's in the chamber pot, it's quite gross. And so we cleaned all that. We soldiered, we bled, we died. Our families died of these disgusting, horrendous diseases. But we aided your cause. We aided your cause. And so the question is, what's going to happen? The question is ultimately what is going to happen. And so what you have is that with the Treaty of Paris, which takes place, as the name says, in Paris amongst British and American diplomats, you have this important article, Article 7, that comes about. And in this Article 7, it reads, all prisoners on both sides shall be set at liberty, and His Britannic Majesty shall, with all convenient speed and without causing any destruction or carrying away any Negroes or any property of the American inhabitants. And so this is an important piece of it, which is to say, effectively, if you're aiding if those Black people that are behind your lines, specifically, especially those who, with the Patriot side, y'all got to give them up. And for more about this, you can read a scholar, Timothy Messer Cruz, who has a recent book called Slavery's Fugitives, that's specifically about the kind of the effect of this in from the war and into the early Republic period as well, leading even well past a bit past the War of 1812. Great book. And so with that, you have this Article 7 where it's like, okay, we have literally on paper. And now it's being spread in the newspapers in 1783 as the news spreads, right? After the preliminary treaty is signed, November 30th of 1782, which sucks because that's also my brother's birthday in the contemporary sense. And so what this inaugurates is a period of incredible fear for Black people because now that you've sided with this losing side, they got to make some concessions. It's a question. Will that be you? And so the Birch trials come about in New York City because by this time in 1783, the British had evacuated their other southern occupied cities of Charleston and Savannah. So at this time, New York is the place where if you think that your enslaved laborer that ran away from you is anywhere, especially if you're from Virginia, it's probably here because many of these Black loyalists had lived in New York for the entirety of the war. They ain't left. Many of the instances, 1775, 1776, or 1779, for example. And so what happens is that the new commander in chief, Sir Guy Carleton, he puts in the local newspaper and spreads it and sends it across to different newspapers that if you can claim an enslaved labor, right, as your own, you can come and take them. And this is the thing, because not only did patriot slaveholders do this, but also loyalist ones too. And so in this, right, and the process, effectively, there are Black people who were exiting among effectively about 3,000, a little less than 3,000 Black people exit British occupied New York City from April to November of 1783. And so effectively, there are Black people on these ships awaiting departure for effectively the majority of 1783. So if you are someone who's trying to claim someone, the process is you go to the police, you effectively give their name, and you're going to try to find them if they're still around. And the Birch trials that happen from May to August of 1783 is also in the heat of some of the greatest numbers of people who are trying to evacuate. And so you not only get taken them off the ship, right? So imagine you're possibly sleeping and a police officer bangs into your spot, takes you off and removes you and just puts you back on space. So that space of refuge that you had in the city is now a space of captivity potentially. And not only do they take you, but these Birch trials that happen every Wednesday from May until about August to September. And this is important. This is where some of these petitions come about. Um, and so ultimately there are three Black women that are really at the center of this. And this is also coming with my book as well. So a lot of these women's stories that I'm detailing will also be in the book. And it'll also help us to better understand ideas of Black loyalism and specifically about Black women in particular as well, because they're at the central issue. And so by the summer of 1783, Dinah Archer, a Black refugee from Norfolk, Virginia, likely thought that she had finally acquired the freedom she longed for after receiving a birth certificate um, on May 3rd of 1783, which was a certificate of passport given by the commandant of the city for Black people to move out. And so Archer had lived in the city since 1779, and she'd actually escaped with her husband named Daniel. And so they arrived in New York after fleeing with the British to reach that prior raid that I had mentioned. And so Dinah's hope for passage to Nova Scotia ultimately worsened when a white loyalist Virginian named William Fair, one of these Scots folks, claimed Archer off the quote La Abondance ship. And so by forcing Archer off the La Abondance, Fair endangered Dinah's ability to leave New York with her husband and the hundreds of other Black people that are on these particular ships. And so, despite Fair's claim upon her, Archer might have also believed receiving her freedom was a mere formality after receiving the birth certificate months before. And so, in these trials, folks like Archer are trying to detail who they are, where they are, and otherwise, right? But ultimately, the court, right, which was set up with American and British diplomats, say otherwise, that you need to wait and we need to send this up the chain of command. And so that's where this particular petition comes about because she was, her actual time was in late July of 1783. And so this petition, August 8th, comes on the heels just shortly after. So she's having now to petition the military officer to say, I am a poor petitioner, embarked with her husband Daniel, and has been here 5 years and came in agreeable to His Excellency General Howe, remember him, but his proclamation, but was claimed by a certain William Fanny and brought on shore, and effectively, right, he's bringing, right, he says he could bring a bill of sale, but he can't. And so she's trying to identify the fact that I had this trial. He still couldn't produce any of the evidence to try to say that I am his. And yet, right, so she's forcing, right? So people try to think about, right, the ideas of, people have in the history of slavery and Black women's history, detailed questions of silence and archival silence and such. And so what the American Revolution does, it creates this new petitioning world, right? These apparatuses for Black people, especially women, to challenge authority, to say that in this case, I'm a Black loyalist and I should be allowed to be moved. And so ultimately, she thankfully was able to leave, and her ship actually left a few weeks after this event too, interestingly enough, without her husband, which we could talk about a little more in Q&A. And so this particular petition also had others as well. Because a woman named Judith Jackson was also inculcated in this. And so it's interesting that Jackson's case, her actual Birch's trial happened right after. So in the transcript, in the court summary, their trials are actually back to back. And interestingly enough, their slaveholders knew each other because they were also major merchants. And so in this case, Judith Jackson was in the same predicament because a white man named Jonathan Eilbeck, a slaveholding Virginian and a Scotsman, claimed Jackson as his own. And it's interesting because he claimed her from his brother-in-law, John McLean, who actually purchased her at an auction in Williamsburg in late April, early May of 1773. And took her to live in Norfolk as his enslaved laborer. And in this case, this is important because Jackson had lived in the city since 1779 and also brought her child with her, gender unknown. And this is important because in this case, she actually worked for the army, for multiple military officers, including Lord Dunmore at one point, over the course of her 4 years as a Black loyalist. And she's thinking, right, I've served these different military officers. I even traveled not only out of New York, but also to Charleston as well. So she had recently come back from Charleston to New York in early 1783. But what happens with Jackson that's interesting is that Ileback comes to claim her off the ship, as was the case with Archer. But what happens from there is that as Jackson is waiting aboard the ship, right, she's taken and brought onto shore to have this trial. And it took about a month and a half, right? Because the same thing that happened to Archer happened to her, that they couldn't adjudicate, right? Because once again, he's a loyalist. What happens is that Jackson's waiting. Once again, the city once was a refuge, but now it is a site of captivity. And what happens often in captivity? People, including your own children, are taken from you. And unfortunately, in the about a month and a half that she has to wait, when she off at the moment she submits the petition, her child is actually taken away from her, along with the money that she had earned. And so her Black loyalism is challenged by a white loyalist, right? Her own alleged slaveholder, and at the very least, the brother-in-law of her owner, right? And this is what I'm going to be talking about more in some subsequent work about family histories and in black and white loyalism. And so in this, what you have is that Jackson, her child is removed from her, and Ileback sends it back to Virginia. And it's interesting because although Archer was allowed to leave, and we have her in the Book of Negroes, Jackson, 2 days after this, right? This is September 18th. 2 days after, it was told to Jackson that Ileback is her rightful slaveholder. But yet, 2 months later, in the final movement of people out of New York, November 30th, off the coast of Staten Island, she is cited in the Book of Negroes, this big ledger of about 3,000 black people black loyalists who aided the British. Excuse me. And this is important because she waited those 2 months. To speculate, she might have been waiting to maybe see if someone could try to retrieve her child for her. But ultimately, in 1784, she's identified in a free Negro muster in Birchtown, right? This new Black loyalist settlement in Nova Scotia, and it's as a single person without anyone else. She's by herself, no child. And so for Jackson, the stakes of Black loyalism was individual freedom, but unfortunately, the collective freedom for her and a child was not, right? Her just desserts here. And so the final piece here is a Black woman who is not actually, interestingly enough, in the Birch trials. Yet her enslaver, John Crammon, right? It says Mr. Crammon, but we see that there's a John Crammon who also is in, interestingly enough, a will with Dunmore, or not Dunmore, with Ileback in 1779, along with Farrer as well, because once again, these ties, the ties of business, the ties of slaveholding, and the ties of Scots ancestry are all ensconced in this. And so Peggy Gwynn, whose husband, I believe is Henry Gwynn, because it's also the same. There's only one other Gwynn and the kind of time frame, or the kind of naming practice. So Peggy Gwynn, interestingly enough, is identified as someone in the artillery department. And this is an interesting detail because if you look at the Book of Negroes that both Dinah Archer and Judith Jackson are in, they are both also members of the artillery department. So interestingly enough, that the only three petitions that happened were not only of Black women, but also women who are in the artillery department, which has employed the most amount of Black people, at least according to the Book of Negroes. But in this case, right, she's expecting to actually leave, right? This is actually happening, I believe November, mid to late November of 1783. And this is important because in this she's saying that I was detained too, that she came here with her husband, but a John Crammon wants to detain me and deprive me of my liberty that I've enjoyed by virtue of the proclamation right? It doesn't know which proclamation, but you can see that Black loyalism is staking claim to these proclamations, whether or not like the Howe's one, like Howe's one, if Black people were actually involved in the actual writing. But unfortunately, it's similar to Clinton's because she's actually said, right? It said as in here too, as page 2, as she is not a free woman, she must be delivered up to her owner. So ultimately, right, when we talk about the stakes of Black loyalism, she's saying that I escaped with my husband. We're able to enjoy this particular life, desirous of liberty. But unfortunately, she was not able to, right? I still think she's a Black loyalist, but a Black loyalist doesn't mean that you become free necessarily, right? And so thank you for the time. And I hope that this was a good sketch to identify a particular Black loyalist, the broader concept of Black loyalism, and to think about this bigger case that hopefully you'll see in the book, which will come out. Shout out to you, Nadine Zimmerly. At the time, we'll see in the next couple of years. So thank you for the time and looking forward to Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. I appreciate that. I appreciate that fascinating conversation, and so much richness there. I was thinking about the difference between when you encounter a historical figure or materials as someone who's working on something else who's not an expert versus when you're an expert. So I have read about, I've even said a few things here and there in print about Judith Jackson, but it just shows that when you're somebody who's thinking about this with your kind of expertise, you know so much more and you can see so much more. So anyway, it was just really, really interesting to hear you talk about this. I'm going to go to a couple of questions here. Let me start with a question about how the three proclamations were interpreted to apply to women and or children. Dunmore's in particular sounded like they were looking for soldiers able and willing to bear arms. So what happened to women? Like you talked about Judith Jackson, you've talked about Dinah Archer, these other women. What happens to them? Like, does anybody think that the proclamations apply to them? Do they even really think those proclamations apply to them?
I think they do. I absolutely think they do. And that's because you have so to take a step back, if you use the runaway slave ads as an indicator of Black people escaping from 1730s to we'll say 1800, Black women are only accounted for less than 200 over the course of that long, 70 years. But you look at the numbers who escaped during the war, it explodes that number. And so to me, to use that as a way to, as a methodologically to think about your question, it helps me to then think that despite the gendered element of Dunmore's proclamation, Black women escaped. And they, in certain ways, couldn't care less if it wasn't about them. And there was, in the Virginia Gazette, there was a lot of off of Gwynn's Island, Matthews County, Virginia. There was, and this was the point where like Dunmore, for those who don't know, this is when Dunmore leaves, right? The Chesapeake, after so many people are dying from disease. There was a lot left in terms of materials that his army left, and including that is a muster of different women. We're talking about like 50 or so women and girls. And those are of the people who are still alive at that point. Numerous others either didn't, they were unsuccessful in their escape. They're in jails, right? You have these examples of women being sent all the way to the lead mines in Southwest Virginia. Shout out to Sean for his work on prison works. So despite the gendered element of Dunmore's proclamation, it was like, all right, whatever you say, we're still going to come. Including, funny enough, a woman that he owned as well, being Lord Dunmore, right? That identifies who's your slave owner at for the Book of Negroes, Lord Dunmore. So clearly, She saw that for her, even though he didn't. Oh, you're muted too, Karen.
It's the day for it.
I'm
Um,
telling you.
um, yeah, it's so interesting to think about this question of sometimes we ask these questions in a way that frames things really tightly. How did people understand liberty? And we mean liberty in this way of like somehow circumscribed by the textual evidence, as opposed to liberty as in people want what they want for themselves. And those are two different things. And it kind of like when people take their liberty, it kind of like doesn't matter what Dunmore meant or didn't mean, right? Um, it's just a really interesting point. But I appreciate that question about the proclamations and their distinction among men and women. This presumption, because I think that's there too, and I think you said that
Oh
too.
yeah.
So here's a question from Robert: Can you clarify my understanding of Guy Carleton?
Yep.
He's been viewed positively because he refused Washington's demand to turn Black people in New York City, to return them to their former claimed enslavers. You suggest that Carleton's Birch trials allowed Loyalist owners to search and seize, though. Am I correct? So, what does this mean about folks who were released, sort of, in the Book of Negroes, not sought by their former owners? It casts like, how do we understand? Is Carleton
Hmm.
like favorable, unfavorable? What's he doing there? He's allowing some people to take their liberty, and he's stopping people, other people. So, what? How do we understand that? What he's doing?
Yeah. See, this
It's a
this is
really
a
good
great
question.
question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, in my mind, Carlton is being a good military leader.
Mm-hmm.
He was not the one. He was not in power when the British lost.
Mm-hmm.
He's coming in after the resignation of Clinton,
Mm-hmm.
invariably, and so he's effectively having to pick up the pieces. And
Mm-hmm.
what that means is, in this case, he's having to think about, what do these proclamations mean? What does it mean for me to give to allow the black people who aided the British not only refuge but freedom? But he's also had tried to balance the aspect that there are numerous hundreds of loyalist slaveholders in his midst, either as
Mm-hmm.
loyalists or as soldiers and their families. And so it's a situation where, right, on one end, he's challenging Washington in this May 3rd meeting where Washington is just getting so pissed off. Like, why are you not giving them to me effectively?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
offering them over, right? And and Carlton is, he's, intransigence is really what's happening on his part.
Yeah.
But at the same
So,
time,
yeah.
he is allowing black people to be taken, right? And this is the thing, right? So Boston King, black loyalist, Charlestonian, I believe, he describes in his memoir slaveholders coming in from Virginia, North Carolina, and other places and taking black people out of their beds.
Mm-hmm.
He talks another, Carl Leopold, Barmeister, talks about 5,000 slaveholders coming into the city. What's it, like 35, 40,000,
Mm-hmm.
40,000 people all across the board. So if you include, if you have 5,000 people come into your city, of 40,000 or 50,000, that's a significant amount, specifically if
Yeah.
they have the intent. And so it's a both and with him, right? He
Mm-hmm.
allowed, right, a certain number of black people to escape, and it was, the Book of Negroes also, it should be said, as an extension of the question, in answer to the question. The Book of Negroes is not this amazing document that was to that was meant for black people to, um for the British to know all of the black people that are their new black loyalists in their midst.
Mm-hmm.
It was literally as a consolation to these slaveholding Virginians and other people to say, right, they're here. So when you try to get your money and your payments back, these are the numbers.
Yeah.
That's really what it's
Mm-hmm.
about. And not a, um, philanthropic gesture. to Black people.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it's so tricky, right? Because sometimes, again, just like with the previous question, sometimes we're looking for one way or the other. Are these people abolitionists, or are they, racist enslavers? And usually they're acting in a totally different context, right? As you
Hmm.
say, Carlton is being a good officer. He is sometimes doing things that we can interpret as having advanced the cause of Black liberty. And then
Hmm.
often he's doing the opposite, but he's
Right.
not doing either out of necessary conviction about this point. He's doing it for this other reason altogether. It's really
Absolutely.
complicatedly interesting. Okay, here's another question. What were the mechanics of these proclamations? Did people who wanted to take advantage of them have to present themselves to someone from the British Army and be declared free? Like, how did this actually work? I thought your presentation of some of that evidence is really interesting on this point.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. This was anonymous. Oh, okay. Thank you, anonymous attendee, for this question. And so, what I'll say is, I'll start actually where you finished, right? And be declared free.
Mm,
I think more than anything, the determination of freedom was fleeting. Like, got to start there, fresh off. First off, but then to your to everything else that came before that, in terms of like the mechanics and who want to take advantage of them to present themselves. So that's the part that I actually am still working on in terms of like it's one thing to describe like a certain person escaping and entering, but it's like a process of like when someone says that they ran away from slavery, how much time are you actually running?
mm,
Like just like, and I think there's an extension in terms of mechanics of it. And so for me, when I think about people entering, um, they, I'll use an example of an actual spy. James Lafayette described his actions as a spy, as a double agent, um, for the American army, for General Lafayette on the Patriot side, that he offered himself, he effectively saying he offered himself as a black refugee to aid
mm,
their cause. And that allowed him to then try to get into good graces with a Lord Cornwallis and other major officers. And so, at least with that example, it shows yes, they did present themselves. Um, and the thing is, like, I guess I'm gonna have to go back to some of the few narratives we have because that's the other part that's interesting. When we think about biography and first person accounts, the reason why these petitions are so important because they're one of the few things that we have. It's murky about the authorship, like who's physically writing it, but more importantly, we know that they submitted themselves, right? In the similar way, um, sure, Sarah Bradford physically wrote the autobiography of Harriet Tubman, but if Harriet Tubman's not sitting down and telling her anything, she can't just get this herself.
mm,
So she's giving it, right? And so I think about that in the same way for some of the for Peggy Gwynn, for Judith Jackson and Donna Archer, in the sense that they don't describe it, but we have a couple examples of people literally coming in and offering themselves as people who want to aid the British. And what they call themselves in terms of black, that we know refugee was a name, we know loyalist was involved there. Um, so in terms of like the mechanics on that end, I believe that's the closest to an answer that I can get at this point. Uh, but you're helping me think about the book more too. So I know I'm gonna have to give some of those pieces as well, so I can get
mm.
out to all the places for people to read.
That is extremely helpful. Let me ask you one last question,
All right.
just about how you come down on the question of ultimately whether you think that, and this is responding to your discussion of the historiography, of the scholarship, the evolving scholarship, whether you think that Black loyalists, I'm going to put that in quotes there, but Black loyalists are held to a different standard of political commitment than others in the kind of whole revolutionary ambit?
Ooh, that's a great question. Quickly, absolutely. And I was talking with someone about this the other day that, um, so I was sitting with Samantha Sealy's class yesterday, literally like yesterday, and
Mhm.
talked to them about some of these similar things, and they were transcribing some of the Loyalist Claims Commission records, and I begin there in terms of the answer because you learn through some of their presentations, like the 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 movement of identity and the movement of allegiance changes. Like there was a black man, I believe, named John Twin, Twine, something to that effect, that described aiding the American army. But
Mm,
I believe, and once again, like I guess this is on the record, so I guess quote me because I'm saying it, but like effectively he moved between American and British side because he wanted money. He wanted better opportunities for his life. And one on one end, he aided the American cause. But then on another,
mhm,
he said, "Well, they gave me the better opportunity." As Siri's trying to get in on this conversation too.
mhm, mhm. It's I think this is so important because as we know, like from work, like this is like a big callback here, but to Ed Countryman's work on revolutionary New York,
Yeah.
that people's allegiances changed during the course of the war. All kinds of people changed their allegiance. White patriot men changed their allegiance. There is no reason in the world why we shouldn't expect that Black people, enslaved or free, would also change their political allegiance as they recalculated what was best for themselves and their family. Anyway, I just think it's just really important to think through.
Absolutely.
So,
And may I say this to add to
yeah.
your point? I think it's important to say yes, in certain ways it might feel uncomfortable to in terms of allegiances and all this stuff in our more contemporary moment, but I think we also have to recognize if we undercut someone's ability to be who they want to be in the
Mm-hmm,
historical world, right? Of a world that we don't live in and never have in terms of late 18th century North America. Really, what you're saying is that they're incapable of having a certain kind
mm,
of politics. That effectively enslavement is so dehumanizing to someone that they cannot have politics that we would disagree with now. Lord knows we do it for
mm-hmm.
everybody else. Why not for these folks here too? Right? Like
Exactly.
like and I think like that to me is why I come on the side of saying that these folks are black loyalists, and then that's the beginning of the conversation, and we can go back and forth and debate. Show me your
Yeah.
facts, I'll show you mine, and we'll go
Yeah.
back and forth. But hey, someone taught me that that's what historiography is all about. She may be in the room, right? That person may have been the moderator for that amazing conversation that happened in March of 2020, right before everything else changed. That
Where
person, y'all
everything
might know it,
changed.
right? Y'all might know who that person is. I think she knows too.
Well, it's always a pleasure, sir. Always a pleasure. Thank you
Yes.
so much for sharing this with us. Always look forward to more of your work. So thank
Thank
you.
you
And
so
thank you
much.
all for joining us today. We hope you all have a
Hey,
great
mom.
evening. Bye bye.